When the HOA president called the cops over my private pool, she never imagined the evidence I had waiting would shatter her power forever. It all started one humid Saturday afternoon. I had just finished skimming the pool in my backyard when Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, appeared at the fence. "Excuse me," she barked, "the community pool is closed today, so you'll need to allow neighbors access to yours." I froze. My pool wasn't part of the HOA's property. I paid for it, maintained it, and it was mine alone. "I'm sorry, Karen," I replied. "This pool isn't for the neighborhood." Her smile twisted into a sneer. "You'll regret that." The Monday morning sun was barely cresting over the rooftops when I stepped onto my porch, coffee mug in hand, expecting nothing more than the usual quiet start to the week. Instead, I was greeted by a trio of envelopes taped to my front door, their edges fluttering in the early breeze. Each one bore the unmistakable letterhead of the HOA, printed in bold, officious font. I peeled them off, the adhesive leaving sticky residue on the wood, and tore into the first one. My grass, apparently, was 0.5 inches above regulation height, warranting a $50 fine. The second complained that my trash bins were visible from the street for a full 12 hours after pickup, another $75. The third was the kicker. My fence, a sturdy cedar structure I'd installed last summer, was deemed non-regulation for its unauthorized stain color. That one came with a $200 penalty and a demand to repaint within 48 hours. At the bottom of each notice, scrawled in sharp, angular handwriting, was Karen's signature, her name practically radiating smug satisfaction. I stood there, the letters crinkling in my grip, and felt a familiar mix of irritation and resignation. This wasn't my first run-in with Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She'd been ruling the neighborhood with an iron clipboard for years, her eagle eyes spotting infractions no one else could see, her fines piling up like trophies in her quest for control. Last month, it was Mrs. Thompson's overly festive Halloween decorations. The month before, Tim's dog had been slapped with a warning for excessive barking during a delivery truck's visit. Karen didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them, targeting anyone who dared to live outside her vision of suburban perfection. I wasn't surprised, not really. My pool, a sparkling oasis I'd saved for years to build, had been a thorn in Karen's side since the first. Shovel hit the dirt. She'd hovered during the construction, snapping photos from the sidewalk, muttering about permits and setbacks. I made sure every detail was above board. County approvals, licensed contractors, inspections passed with flying colors. But Karen didn't care about facts. She cared about power, and my refusal to grovel at her feet made me a target. I tucked the notices under my arm and headed inside, setting them on the kitchen counter next to my coffee. As I sipped the now lukewarm brew, I tried to focus on the day ahead, work, errands, maybe a swim later to clear my head. But my stomach churned, not just from the fines or the audacity of Karen's signature, but from something I'd heard the night before. Mr. Henderson, my neighbor across the street, had pulled me aside while I was watering my plants, his voice low and urgent. "Watch out for Karen," he'd said, glancing over his shoulder as if she might materialize from the shadows. "I overheard her at the coffee shop, talking to Ms. Larson. She's planning a community swim day at your pool. Said she's going to force her way in, claim it's HOA property, or some nonsense." The words had hit me like a punch. My pool, my private sanctuary, paid for with years of overtime and careful budgeting, was no one's but mine. The idea of Karen, with her clipboard and her self-righteous smirk, marching into my backyard with a gaggle of neighbors she'd bullied into compliance, made my blood boil. It wasn't just an invasion. It was a power play, a way to assert her dominance and remind me who she thought ran this neighborhood. I spent the morning digging through my files, pulling out the pool's permits and the property deed, double-checking every line. Everything was in order, just as I'd known it would be. But Karen didn't operate on logic or legality. She operated on intimidation. I'd seen her do it before, cornering the Garcias into repainting their mailbox, threatening Mrs. Patel with a lien over a non-compliant bird feeder. She thrived on making people feel small, on bending them to her will. But I wasn't the Garcias or Mrs. Patel. I wasn't going to roll over. By noon, I drafted a polite but firm response to the violation notices, citing the county's regulations on grass length, no maximum specified, trash bin placement, no ordinance violated, and fence aesthetics, fully compliant with HOA guidelines, which I'd checked before staining. I attached copies of my permits and emailed the response to the HOA board, knowing Karen would see it and seethe. But the rumor about the community swim day gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the image of her striding through my gate, waving some fabricated HOA bylaw, her voice shrill as she declared my pool open to all. I called Mr. Henderson to confirm what he'd heard. She was dead serious, he said, his voice grim. Said it's only fair since you're flaunting that pool. She's telling people it's a safety hazard, that it needs to be shared to prevent liability. I don't trust her not to try something. I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. Karen wasn't just coming for my pool. She was coming for my peace, my autonomy, my right to exist in this neighborhood without her shadow looming over me. I checked my Ring camera, half expecting to see her lurking already, but the street was quiet. For now. That evening, I sat by the pool, the water glowing under the setting sun. It was more than a luxury. It was a symbol of everything I'd worked for, a place to unwind after long days, to float and forget the world. The thought of Karen violating that space, of turning it into another battleground, made my chest tighten. But I wasn't helpless. I had my permits, my evidence, my resolve. If Karen wanted to fight, she'd get one, just not the kind she expected. I opened my laptop and started a new document, titling it HOA Violations Evidence. I scanned the notices, saved screenshots of the county codes, and backed up my camera footage. If Karen was planning her community swim day, she'd have to get through me first. And I was ready. The confrontation exploded on a Saturday afternoon, just as the neighborhood kids were riding their bikes past my driveway. Karen didn't come alone this time. She marched up flanked by 3 HOA board members, all of them in matching polo shirts embroidered with the association's logo. The sight felt less like neighbors dropping by and more like a squadron staging an ambush. Karen's heels clicked like a metronome of authority as she waved a folder of papers high above her head. "You can't keep amenities locked from residents," she barked, her voice pitched deliberately loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. A few curious neighbors leaned on their fences, drawn in like spectators at a street fight. I stood my ground at the gate to my pool. My chest tightened, but I forced my tone to stay even. "That's not an amenity," I said, pointing to the sign I'd installed. "Private property. No trespassing. This isn't community space. It's mine. I paid for it. I maintain it." Her lip curled, and she let out a scoff that carried more venom than any curse word. "We'll see about that." She reached into her purse, slowly, deliberately, as if she were about to draw a weapon. What came out was far more dangerous in her hands. Her phone. She tapped the screen and locked eyes with me, wearing a smirk that belonged to someone who believed she was untouchable. Within seconds, her voice filled the street, shrill and rehearsed. "Yes, this is an emergency," she snapped. "I'm reporting a hostile man denying community access. He's threatening residents. Yes, send officers immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke. I could see the shock ripple through the bystanders. Some looked away uncomfortably, others whispered, but Karen only doubled down, adding trembling inflections to her voice like an actress chasing an Oscar. One of the board members, a tall man with a gut that strained his polo, chimed in for effect. "He's been aggressive for weeks," he said loudly enough to carry. "We don't feel safe." My fists clenched at my sides. Safe? They had cornered me on my own property, raised their voices, and now they were calling me the threat. It was the kind of narrative Karen was an expert at spinning, weaponizing fear, twisting perception. "Stop this," I said firmly. "You're lying to the police. You're wasting their time." Karen's grin widened as if I had already lost. "They'll believe me over you. Always do." Minutes later, I heard it, the faint wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder with every second. My stomach turned to stone. Neighbors hurried to their porches, phones in hand, recording the scene like it was a free show. Karen smoothed her hair, squared her shoulders, and whispered to the board members, "Watch how fast this gets resolved." As the red and blue lights splashed across the cul-de-sac, I realized exactly what Karen wanted. Humiliation, a public display of power. She wanted me in handcuffs, branded as the problem neighbor. And unless I found a way to turn this around, she just might succeed. Within 10 minutes, the low hum of engines filled the air. Two police cruisers turned into the cul-de-sac, their lights flashing, painting the houses in streaks of red and blue. The wail of the siren cut off, leaving behind a thick silence, broken only by the creak of blinds snapping open and the shuffle of neighbors pressing against their windows for a better view. Karen straightened her red dress, her posture snapping into place like a soldier preparing for inspection. Arms crossed, chin tilted, she stood as though she had summoned the law itself to carry out her will. The three HOA board members clustered behind her like loyal foot soldiers. The officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning the scene. One, a younger man with sharp features, took the lead. "Sir," he said, looking squarely at me, "is there a problem here?" I opened my mouth, but Karen swooped in with the precision of a hawk diving for prey. "Yes, officer. He's breaking HOA law and refusing rightful access to the pool." She pointed toward my locked gate with theatrical flair. "This is our pool. He's denying the community what belongs to us." Her voice rose in fake outrage, just loud enough for the neighbors recording from their porches to hear. The performance was flawless, her trembling tone designed to paint herself as the victim, her stance daring me to contradict her. The officer's brow furrowed as he glanced at me, confusion flickering across his face. "Is that true, sir? Is this shared property?" I didn't flinch. I had expected this moment. Days earlier, after Karen's first threats, I had prepared a folder that never left my study. Now, with steady hands, I pulled it from under my arm and handed it over. "Take a look," I said, my voice calm, measured, almost cold. Inside were property deeds with my name clearly printed, city permits outlining construction approval, and a notarized letter from my lawyer explicitly stating that the land was private property and outside HOA jurisdiction. Every document had tabs and highlights, prepared with the foresight of someone who knew this fight would one day turn legal. The officer flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. He motioned his partner over, and together they scanned the papers beneath the flashing lights. "This is my land," I continued evenly. "The HOA has no jurisdiction here. They've been harassing me, trying to claim authority they don't have." Karen's smirk faltered. She stepped forward, voice dripping with contempt. "He forged those papers. He must have. He's lying. I've lived here long enough to know this pool was meant for residents." "Ma'am," the younger officer cut her off sharply. "These are official city permits and notarized documents. That's not something you can fake overnight." The second officer, older and calmer, looked directly at Karen. "Do you have any paperwork proving the HOA's ownership over this property?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted to the board members behind her. They shifted uneasily, exchanging glances, but none produced so much as a scrap of paper. The silence dragged out like a noose tightening. Neighbors across the street were whispering now, phones still pointed in our direction. For the first time, Karen looked less like a queen on her throne and more like a child caught in a lie. I folded my arms. "If you're done wasting police time," I said, keeping my tone controlled, "I'd like to get back to enjoying my Saturday without being falsely accused." The older officer closed the folder and handed it back to me with a nod of respect. "Everything here checks out. This is his property. HOA has no authority over it." Karen's face flushed crimson, her lips trembling with the weight of fury she couldn't unload without exposing her lies. And that was when I realized something. She hadn't expected me to be prepared. She thought intimidation and spectacle would win the day. But the tide had turned, and she knew it. Still, the fire in her eyes told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen's face drained of color as the officer thumbed through the paperwork, pausing now and then to double-check seals and signatures. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the buzz of cicadas and the faint click of someone's phone camera recording every second. Finally, the officer closed the folder and fixed Karen with a firm stare. "Ma'am," he said, his tone flat and authoritative, "this pool is private property. It is not listed as a community amenity, and the HOA has no legal claim over it." The words hit her like a hammer to the chest. For a heartbeat, she froze, her carefully painted expression shattering. Then the storm broke. "This is harassment," she screamed, her voice raw, trembling with rage. "He's selfish. He's hiding behind loopholes. He's ruining the spirit of this neighborhood." Her arms flailed as though she were swatting at invisible enemies. The board members behind her shifted uncomfortably, edging back toward the sidewalk, suddenly less eager to be her backup dancers. "Enough," the officer snapped, his patience worn thin. "If you continue trespassing, you'll be the one in violation. Do you understand me?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her gaze darted wildly, from the officer, to me, to the neighbors leaning on porches and fences. Dozens of eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time, she wasn't the one holding court. She was the spectacle. A woman across the street whispered, not quietly enough. She finally lost it. A man chuckled under his breath, pulling his son closer as if to shield him from the outburst. The queen of the HOA, the self-proclaimed guardian of order, stood trembling in the glare of police lights, and the cracks in her crown were now impossible to ignore. Karen stomped a heel against the pavement, her face blotched red. "You're all blind," she shouted at the neighborhood. "He's the problem. You'll regret siding with him when he ruins this place." But the more she spoke, the weaker her grip on the crowd became. Her voice, once commanding, now sounded desperate, frantic. One of the board members muttered something about needing to regroup and quietly slipped away. Another followed, leaving her standing alone in the spotlight she had created for herself. The older officer took a slow step toward her. "Ma'am, this is your only warning. Go home. Do not step foot on this property again." Her lip trembled. For a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she spun on her heel and stormed down the street, muttering curses that grew fainter with every step. The neighbors didn't clap, didn't jeer, but their silence spoke volumes. Their eyes followed her retreat, and in that silence was judgment. I closed the gate behind me and exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Karen had been publicly dethroned, stripped of her authority in front of the very people she ruled over. But as the cruisers pulled away and the cul-de-sac returned to quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Queens don't surrender their crowns. They plot comebacks. And Karen, I knew, was already planning her next move. The night after Karen's meltdown, I sat at my kitchen table with the blinds drawn and a quiet satisfaction humming in my chest. For weeks, she had harassed me, spat fines onto my doorstep like confetti, tried to rally the neighborhood against me, and even called the police on me with lies designed to humiliate me. But what she never suspected was that I'd been preparing for this moment long before the flashing blue lights arrived on our street. On the table sat a black case, slim and unassuming. Inside were my weapons, not guns or knives, but memory cards labeled and dated. I had been recording everything. Every conversation, every confrontation, every HOA meeting where her voice dripped venom and entitlement. Every time she stormed onto my property with threats of violations or waved her fabricated fines in my face. Each insult, each declaration that she would make me pay was preserved in crystal clarity. For weeks, I had played the role of the calm, stubborn neighbor, the lone dissenter against the mighty HOA. But beneath that mask, I had been archiving her downfall one soundbite at a time. And now, the time had come to use it. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the rented community hall. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs, talk of landscaping budgets, parking disputes, and arguments over paint colors. But after the police visit, the air in the neighborhood was thick with tension. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Everyone wanted to see her. By the time I arrived, the lot outside the hall was nearly full. Neighbors lingered near their cars, whispering in clusters, their eyes darting toward the building's entrance as if they were about to witness a trial. Inside, folding chairs lined up in neat rows faced the podium where Karen usually presided like royalty, gavel in hand. Tonight, though, she looked uneasy. She wore another bold dress, emerald green this time, but there was a tightness in her smile, a flicker of insecurity in her eyes. "Order," she said, tapping the gavel. "We'll begin with tonight's agenda." I slipped into a seat near the middle, a plain black projector case at my feet. No one noticed. Karen droned through the first few points, her voice wavering slightly, but still attempting authority. First, budget allocations for next quarter. Second, review of landscaping compliance. She shuffled papers, trying to move quickly to get through the agenda before anything could explode. Then came item 4, community amenities enforcement. Her voice hardened, her eyes flicked briefly toward me. "As you know, we've had recent disputes regarding the proper use of neighborhood spaces." That was my cue. I stood, slowly, deliberately. My chair scraped the floor, drawing every eye in the room. "Actually," I said, my voice calm but firm, "before we discuss that, I think the community deserves to hear something." Karen's head snapped up. "You're not on the schedule to speak," she snapped. I bent down, lifted the projector case onto the table, and flipped the latches. "Doesn't matter," I said evenly. "This concerns everyone." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen tried to regain control. "Sit down, or you'll be removed." But she didn't know. I had already cleared it with the property manager who rented us the hall. The projector, the screen, the speakers, everything was ready. I connected my laptop, the screen glowing bright against the blank wall behind her. Karen turned, squinting at the light. "What are you?" And then the first clip played. Her voice filled the hall, sharp, unmistakable. "I'll make his life hell until he gives in." The room went dead silent. Gasps punctured the air. Heads whipped toward Karen. She froze, her lips parted in horror, her skin paling. I clicked again. The next clip echoed in her own words, dripping with malice. "We can find him in a foreclosure if needed. I don't care what it takes." The audience reacted like a jury watching undeniable evidence of guilt. One of the board members, seated near the podium, visibly stiffened. Another turned pale, his lips pressed tight as though he'd just swallowed poison. I let the silence hang for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on every person in the room. Then I spoke. "For weeks, you've been told that I was the problem, that I was selfish, hostile, even dangerous. But here's the truth. This isn't about community or safety or rules. This is about power, and Karen has been abusing hers." More murmurs. A woman in the back raised her phone, recording everything. Karen lurched forward, slamming her palm against the podium. "This is taken out of context," she screeched. "He edited that. He's manipulating all of you." But her voice cracked. Her eyes darted, panicked, searching for backup among the board. None came. I clicked again. Another clip played, her voice more venomous than before. "I'll destroy his reputation before I let him win." Someone in the front row muttered, "Oh my God." Karen's face twisted, red blotches crawling up her neck. She banged the gavel, her voice shaking. "This meeting is adjourned," she shouted. "Adjourned." But no one moved. No one obeyed. "Adjourned," I said, stepping closer. "Or are you just afraid of the truth?" She pointed at me, her hand trembling. You won't get away with this. You think you're clever, but you're nothing but a troublemaker. A liar. You'll regret this." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so only those nearest could hear. "No, got in. The only one who regrets something tonight is you." The last clip played. Her voice again, calm, smug, unfiltered. "They'll believe me over him. Always do." The hall erupted. Gasps, murmurs, whispered accusations. The illusion was shattered. Karen wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was the villain. The board members looked at one another, their faces gray. One cleared his throat. We need to address this. Immediately." Karen's chest heaved. She slammed the gavel again, this time not for order, but as if striking against her own collapse. "You're all blind. He's manipulating you," she cried, her voice breaking. But no one believed her anymore. The mask had slipped. The recordings had spoken. I shut down the projector, packed the case, and walked toward the exit. Every eye followed me, not with suspicion anymore, but with something new: respect. And Karen, still trembling at the podium, was left to drown in the silence she could no longer control. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew this was only the beginning. Queens don't fall quietly. They claw, they scheme, they burn everything they can on their way down. And Karen wasn't done yet. The air in the community center was thick with tension, the kind that settles over a room when a long-simmering conflict is about to boil over. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow on the rows of folding chairs, each occupied by a neighbor with a stake in the drama about to unfold. At the front of the room, Karen sat at the head of the HOA board table, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. She clutched a stack of papers, her meticulously prepared agenda, no doubt, her knuckles whitening as she sensed the shift in the room. The queen of the neighborhood, the self-appointed enforcer of rules and decorum, was about to face her reckoning. The meeting had started innocently enough. Karen opened with her usual spiel about the importance of maintaining property values, her voice dripping with that condescending tone she'd perfected over years of HOA dominance. She droned on about mailbox uniformity, lawn maintenance violations, and her latest crusade against unsightly backyard trampolines. But the murmurs in the crowd grew louder with every word, a low hum of dissent that she either didn't notice or chose to ignore. I sat near the back, my notebook open but untouched, my pen dangling loosely in my hand. I wasn't here to take notes. I was here to witness. For months, Karen's reign had cast a shadow over the neighborhood. Her petty fines, her passive-aggressive emails, her habit of peering over fences to catch infractions, it had all built to this moment. The false 911 call she'd made last week, accusing Mr. Henderson of suspicious activity for planting tulips at dusk, had been the final straw. The police report, now public, sat like a guillotine blade above her head. Mrs. Patel, a soft-spoken retiree who rarely attended these meetings, stood first. Her hands trembled slightly as she held up a printed email from Karen, one that threatened a $500 fine for a non-compliant bird feeder. "This has gone too far," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "We're neighbors, not prisoners. Karen, you've abused your power for too long." A ripple of agreement spread through the room. Mr. Henderson, still fuming from the 9/11 incident, stood next, his voice booming. "You call the police on me for gardening. Gardening. You've turned this neighborhood into a police state." The crowd erupted in applause, and Karen's face flushed a deep crimson. She tried to interject, banging her gavel on the table, but the room was no longer hers to control. One by one, neighbors stood to air their grievances. There was the young couple, the Garcias, who'd been fined for parking their car incorrectly in their own driveway. There was Mrs. Thompson, whose holiday decorations had been deemed excessive by Karen's arbitrary standards. Even Tim, the quiet guy who mowed everyone's lawns for free, spoke up about the time Karen reported his dog for barking too loudly during a delivery truck's visit. Each story added weight to the growing case against her, a litany of petty tyrannies that had finally united the neighborhood in revolt. When the time came for the vote, it was almost ceremonial. The motion to remove Karen as HOA president was proposed by Mrs. Patel, seconded by half a dozen others before she could finish speaking. Hands shot up across the room, a unanimous wave of rejection. Karen's eyes darted from face to face, searching for allies, but found none. Even her usual supporters, Mr. Crowley, who shared her obsession with Hedge Heights, and Ms. Larson, who'd once praised Karen's leadership, sat silent, their gazes fixed on the floor. The final tally was read aloud. 42 in favor of removal, 0 opposed. Karen's gavel slipped from her hand, clattering onto the table. For a moment, she sat frozen, her carefully curated facade of authority crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she gathered her papers, shoved them into her oversized tote bag, and stood. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with venom. "This neighborhood will fall apart without me." No one responded. The room watched in silence as she stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking furiously against the linoleum floor. The glass door swung shut behind her, and a collective exhale filled the space, as if the neighborhood itself had been holding its breath. But the fallout wasn't over. The police report from her false 911 call had been added to her record, a permanent mark that would follow her. Whispers of lawsuits circulated among the neighbors. Mr. Henderson was already in touch with a lawyer about harassment, and the Garcias were considering a defamation claim. Karen's reign, built on fear and control, had collapsed under the weight of her own actions. As the meeting adjourned, I lingered by the door, watching the neighbors file out into the evening air. There was a lightness to their steps, a quiet relief in their conversations. The Queen had fallen, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it might belong to us again. The summer sun hung high in the cloudless sky, casting a golden shimmer across the surface of my backyard pool. I lounged on a cushioned chair, a cold lemonade sweating in my hand, the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge blending with the hum of cicadas. For the first time in years, the air felt light. Not just the warm, lazy breeze of summer, but something deeper, something freer. Peace had returned to the neighborhood, and with it, a sense of reclaiming what was mine. My pool, my rules. Gone were the days of Karen's reign, her clipboard-wielding inspections, her passive-aggressive notes taped to my gate about unauthorized pool modifications or excessive noise from a single splash. Gone were the bogus fines that arrived in my mailbox like clockwork, each one a thinly veiled attempt to assert her dominance. The HOA, now led by the soft-spoken but resolute Mrs. Patel, had rewritten the rulebook, literally. The draconian regulations Karen had enforced were scrapped, replaced with guidelines that prioritize community over control. No more threats, no more petty power plays. The change was palpable. Neighbors who once scurried past my house, heads down to avoid Karen's watchful eye or her inevitable complaints about their lawns, now paused to wave. The Garcias, whose toddler had once been the target of a noise violation for laughing too loudly during a barbecue, stopped by to invite me to their next cookout. Mr. Henderson, still beaming from his victory over Karen's false 911 call, brought over a cutting from his prized tulip bed as a gesture of goodwill. Even Tim, the lawn-mowing saint of the neighborhood, lingered to chat about his dog's new trick rather than rushing off, wary of another baseless report. But the shadow of Karen wasn't entirely gone. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of her walking past my house, her pace brisk, her eyes narrowed into a glare that could curdle milk. She never stopped, never spoke, never set foot near my property. The restraining order Mr. Henderson had secured after her 911 stunt probably had something to do with that. Still, her presence was a reminder of the battle that had been fought and won. Each time I saw her, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in her defeat, but in the resilience of the truth. I'd spent months preparing for that moment, though I hadn't known it at the time. Every fine, every email, every absurd accusation, I'd kept them all. A folder on my desk held copies of her notices, time-stamped photos of my non-compliant pool, perfectly within code, as the city inspector confirmed, and even a recording of the time she'd screamed at me through my Ring camera about a pool float left out overnight. I'd been patient, biding my time, letting her dig her own grave with every lie and overreach. When the HOA meeting came, when the neighbors finally stood together, my evidence had been the kindling that fueled their fire. The police report from her false 911 call was the spark. As I sipped my lemonade, I thought about the lesson at the heart of it all. Karen had believed she could bend the neighborhood to her will through fear, lies, and the weight of her self-proclaimed authority. She'd weaponized rules, twisted truths, and even tried to wield the police as her personal enforcers. But she'd underestimated me, underestimated all of us. She never realized that truth doesn't bend, that patience can outlast pettiness, and that proof, when carefully gathered, is an unbreakable shield. I leaned back in my chair, the sun warming my face, and watched a group of kids from down the street race through a sprinkler in their yard, their laughter echoing without fear of reprimand. The neighborhood was ours again, and as for me, I dipped my toes in the cool water of my pool, smiled, and thought, my pool, my rules. The summer had settled into a deceptive calm, the kind that fools you into believing the storm has passed. I'd grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood post-Karen. Neighbors chatting freely over fences, kids playing without fear of a fine for a stray ball, and my backyard pool gleaming under the sun, unmarred by petty HOA notices. I thought it was over. That Karen's ousting as HOA president had marked the end of her reign. But Karen wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background. She was a woman who thrived on control, and losing it only fueled her desperation to claw it back. It started subtly, the way trouble often does. A week after the HOA meeting where she'd been voted out, I noticed an unfamiliar black SUV idling near my driveway. Its tinted windows obscured the driver, but the engine purred with a kind of deliberate menace, lingering just long enough to make me uneasy before pulling away. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, Karen's power was gone, her influence shattered. What did she do now? But the next morning, I stepped outside to find a ripped garbage bag strewn across my front yard. Its contents, soggy coffee grounds, banana peels, and crumpled fast food wrappers, scattered like a taunt. I cleaned it up, my jaw tight, telling myself it was just a prank, maybe kids. But a nagging suspicion gnawed at me. On the third night, my Ring camera caught her. The footage was grainy, the timestamp glowing 11:47 p.m. But there she was, Karen, standing at the edge of my fence, her silhouette unmistakable under the streetlight's dim glow. She was muttering into her phone, her voice too low for the microphone to catch, but her posture radiated intent. She paced back and forth, glancing toward my house, her movements sharp and agitated. I watched the clip on my phone, my heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of certainty. Karen was planning something. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I'd learned from months of dealing with her that impulsiveness was her weapon, not mine. Instead, I doubled down on vigilance. I checked my security cameras daily, backed up every clip, and made sure my pool's permits, already verified by the county, were organized in a folder on my desk. I'd been through too much to let her catch me off guard again. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, and I had a feeling Karen would make her move there. The community center was packed, the air buzzing with a mix of curiosity and lingering resentment. Mrs. Patel, now the HOA president, opened the meeting with a calm efficiency that felt like a bomb after Karen's tyrannical rule. She discussed upcoming community events, a summer picnic, a fundraiser for the local park, and the room responded with nods and murmurs of approval. But I kept my eyes on the door, waiting. Sure enough, halfway through the meeting, it swung open with a dramatic bang. Karen strode in, her heels clicking like gunshots on the linoleum floor, clutching a thick manila folder stuffed with papers. She wore a navy blazer and a smug expression, as if she'd never been dethroned. As a concerned resident, she announced, her voice cutting through the room, I demand to be heard. Mrs. Patel raised an eyebrow, but nodded, her composure unshaken. Go ahead, Karen. You have the floor. Karen didn't hesitate. She launched into a tirade, her words sharp and rehearsed, accusing me of illegally building my pool without proper permits. She waved her folder like a battle flag, pulling out printed screenshots of county codes, pages she'd clearly spent hours scouring online but barely understood. This pool is a violation of county regulations, she declared, pointing at me from across the room. It's a safety hazard, an eyesore, and a blatant disregard for the law. I have evidence right here. The room went silent, all eyes on me. I felt the weight of their stares, but I wasn't rattled. I'd been ready for this. Karen's accusations were nothing new. They were just a louder, more desperate version of the same playbook she'd used for years. But she'd miscalculated, assuming I hadn't anticipated her final gambit. Before I could respond, a man in the front row stood up, clearing his throat. It was Mr. Callahan, the county inspector I'd spoken to weeks ago, when Karen's complaint about my pool first surfaced. I'd invited him to the meeting, suspecting Karen might try something like this. He adjusted his glasses and held up a slim folder of his own, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm David Callahan, County Building Inspector. I've reviewed the property in question. Ms. Your name?" Spool, at length. "I have the official report here." He opened the folder and held up a stamped document. "This property has passed every inspection. All permits are in order, and the construction complies with county codes. These accusations are baseless." A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing into a wave of whispers. Karen's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "That's impossible," she sputtered, clutching her papers tighter. "I have the codes right here. You can't do this to me." But the room had already turned against her. Mrs. Patel's voice cut through the tension, firm but measured. "Karen, you've made your point. The inspector has provided his report. Unless you have new evidence, actual evidence, this matter is closed." Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but found none. The neighbor she'd once controlled with her fines and threats now sat with crossed arms or averted gazes. Mr. Henderson, still stinging from her false 911 call, leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk. The Garcias, who'd faced her wrath over their toddler's laughter, whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. Even Ms. Larson, Karen's former ally, stared at her lap, unwilling to meet her eyes. "You can't do this," Karen shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I built this HOA. I made this neighborhood what it is." But her words fell flat, echoing in a room that no longer belonged to her. The Queen had officially lost her kingdom. Mrs. Patel banged the gavel, a sound Karen had once wielded like a scepter, and moved on to the next agenda item. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her folder trembling in her hands, before turning on her heel and storming out. The door slammed behind her, and the room exhaled, the tension dissipating like smoke. After the meeting, I lingered outside, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. A few neighbors approached, offering quiet words of support. "You handled that well," Mr. Henderson said, clapping me on the shoulder. "She's done." Mrs. Garcia nodded, her toddler asleep in her arms. "Thank you for standing up to her. We all should have done it sooner." I smiled, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Karen's last move had been a desperate one, a final attempt to reclaim the power she'd lost. But she'd underestimated me, just as she'd underestimated the neighborhood. I'd been ready, not just with permits and reports, but with the quiet strength of truth and preparation. Her lies, her trash dumping, her late-night skulking. They were the flailings of a woman who couldn't accept defeat. But defeat had found her anyway. As I walked home, the glow of my porch light welcoming me back, I thought about the SUV, the garbage, the camera footage. I'd already sent the clips to my lawyer, just in case. Karen might try again. She wasn't the type to learn her lesson easily. But I was ready. The neighborhood was ready. And for now, the pool sparkled under the moonlight, undisturbed, a symbol of a victory hard won. The lesson wasn't just Karen's downfall. It was the power of standing firm, of gathering proof, of waiting for the right moment. She thought she could break me, break us, with her schemes and accusations. But the truth doesn't bend, and neither did I. The weeks that followed Karen's dramatic exit from the HOA meeting were a revelation. A quiet so profound it felt like the neighborhood itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. The air was lighter, the streets softer, as if the oppressive weight of Karen's reign had lifted like morning fog burned away by the sun. No more notes taped to my door, their corners curling with passive-aggressive threats. No more fines slipped in my mailbox, demanding payment for infractions that existed only in Karen's imagination. No more unfamiliar SUVs idling near my driveway or shadowy figures skulking at the edge of my property. Karen had gone silent, and with her silence, the neighborhood began to heal. I noticed the change in small, beautiful ways. The Garcias hosted a barbecue, their toddler's laughter ringing out without fear of a noise violation. Mr. Henderson planted a new row of tulips, bold and red, along his front walk, no longer worried about a late-night 911 call branding him a criminal. Mrs. Thompson strung fairy lights across her porch, their warm glow defying the old HOA rules about excessive decorations. Even Tim's dog, Max, barked freely at passing squirrels, his tail wagging with the unbridled joy of a neighborhood unshackled. For the first time in years, we were more than a collection of houses bound by rules. We were a community. I spent my evenings by the pool, the water a cool, glassy mirror reflecting the fading summer light. The pool had been the epicenter of Karen's obsession, her endless complaints about its permits, its size, its very existence. Now, it was my sanctuary, a place to float and think and savor the quiet victory. I'd fought for this peace, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd suffered under Karen's petty tyranny. The folder of evidence on my desk, her emails, her fines, the Ring camera footage of her late-night scheming, had been my shield, but it was the neighborhood's collective stand that had been the sword. Then, one evening, as the scent of charcoal and grilled peppers filled the air, I heard footsteps at the fence. I was flipping burgers on the patio, the sizzle of meat mingling with the soft hum of crickets when the sound stopped me cold. It was a familiar rhythm, sharp and deliberate, but slower than I remembered. I set the tongs down and turned, my heart steady but alert. There, at the edge of my fence, stood Karen. She looked different. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of something heavier than her usual blazer. Her eyes, once sharp with righteous indignation, were hollow, shadowed by exhaustion or defeat or both. Her hair, always meticulously styled, was pulled back in a messy bun, strands escaping like threads of a fraying tapestry. She didn't carry her clipboard or her folder of county codes. She didn't yell or wave accusations. She just stood there, her hands limp at her sides, and whispered, "You ruined me." The words hung in the air, fragile and raw. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, not for the woman she'd been, but for the shell she'd become. But pity didn't erase the months of harassment, the false 911 calls, the trash dumped in my yard, the nights I'd spent checking my cameras to ensure she wasn't plotting her next move. I stepped closer to the fence, meeting her gaze. "No, Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You ruined yourself." She flinched, as if the truth were a physical blow. For a moment, I thought she might argue, might summon the old fire that had fueled her crusades. But she didn't. She just stared at me, her lips trembling, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the dusk. It was the last time I saw her. Word spread quickly, as it does in a neighborhood finally free to talk openly. Karen had put her house on the market, a for sale sign appearing in her perfectly manicured lawn overnight. By the end of the month, it was gone, sold to a young family with a golden retriever and a tricycle parked in the driveway. No one knew where Karen had gone. Some said she'd moved to a condo across town. Others whispered about a gated community where she could start fresh, though I doubted any HOA would let her near a position of power again. Her absence was a relief, but it was more than that. It was closure. Life slowly returned to normal, or rather, to a new kind of normal, one where neighbors smiled instead of scurried, where rules served the community instead of suffocating it. I hosted a pool party, the first in years without the specter of Karen's disapproval. The Garcias brought their famous guacamole. Mrs. Patel contributed a tray of samosas, and Mr. Henderson showed up with a six-pack of craft beer, grinning as he recounted the tulip incident to anyone who'd listen. Kids splashed in the pool, their laughter echoing into the night, and for once, no one looked over their shoulder for a clipboard-wielding enforcer. One warm night, after the last guest had gone, I floated in the pool, the water cradling me as the stars blinked above. The air was still, the only sounds the gentle ripple of water and the distant hum of a neighbor's sprinkler. I closed my eyes, letting the moment sink in. After months of harassment, battles, and police visits, I finally had peace. The pool wasn't just mine anymore. It was a symbol, a quiet monument to resilience. It stood for every time I'd refused to bend, every piece of evidence I'd saved, every neighbor who'd stood up to say enough. Karen had thought she could break me, break us, with her rules and lies and arrogance. She'd seen herself as untouchable, a queen whose word was law. But bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, always drown in their own hubris. Her downfall wasn't just her ousting or her move. It was the silence she left behind, a silence that spoke louder than her loudest tirades. It was the sound of a neighborhood reborn, of a community that had learned its own strength. As I floated, the water cool against my skin, I thought about the lesson at the heart of it all. Power built on fear and control is fragile, a house of cards waiting for the slightest push. Karen's kingdom had crumbled because she'd underestimated the truth, underestimated the people she sought to dominate. And in the end, it was her own actions, her lies, her schemes, her refusal to let go, that had brought her down. The stars shimmered above, reflected in the still surface of the pool. I smiled, my heart light. The fight was over. The silence was final. And the pool, my pool, was a testament to the victory of patience, proof, and the unyielding power of standing your ground.